Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of Ship Views with me, Carburetor. Today we are going to be looking at the Forrest Sherman and comparing her to the USS Gearing. Why that comparison? Because they are both, for all intents and purposes, Tier 10 American destroyers, and they're both kind of gunboat destroyers. A little bit about the Forrest Sherman. Right now, she is not available for purchase. You can only get her through these special containers. The firepower premium containers, which I did a previous video on. I'd recommend going back and checking out that video if you haven't seen it already. But eventually she probably will be available for either coal or steel, maybe even doubloons eventually in the future. It used to be a solid rule at Wargaming that they would not sell tier 10s, but if we actually go into the armory and check this out, you can see that right now you can buy the Marceau and the Hayate for a little over $100. I believe 2,400, 25,000 doubloons is $100, so it'd be about about $140, $150. Let's talk about the real-life Forrest Sherman. The real-life Forrest Sherman was launched in 1955. Now, it's really not fair comparing it to the Gearing, which was launched in 1945. The Forrest Sherman is definitely one of the newest ships in the game, and I mean that as far as when it was launched. I think the newest ship that we have in the game might be the Belfast at 1957. I don't know. I'm not that much of a history buff. I'm a huge U.S. history buff. I'm not a generic warships history buff. So if any of you have that answer, please feel free to leave it. I've been working on this video for a really long time trying to get it. I ground out the Gearing only for them to give the Gearing away for the clan battle. So yeah. Oh, that was kind of disappointing, but what do you expect? Anyway, let's start by going over the Forrest Sherman in general, comparing her to the Gearing. How do both of them compare? You'll see little pop-up screens come here now with all of the stats. Gearing survivability versus Forrest Sherman survivability. Gearing has 35 survivability score versus the Forrest Sherman's 41. Now, I will say both of these ships are very survivable, but the Forrest Sherman definitely has more of a heavy destroyer build versus the Gearing's more medium destroyer build. And that's reflective in the survivability, with 19,400 hit points with the Gearing and 24,900 with the Forrest Sherman. That is a very, very strong ship for a destroyer. Now, that is definitely something to consider when you're bringing these into battle. The Forrest Sherman's definitely going to be a little bit more of a sit and take a few hits, whereas the Gearing, you're going to want to get her out of the combat area sooner rather than later. But that can be discussed a little bit later on when we get to the maneuverability. Let's talk about artillery. Artillery 28 to 22. Now, I actually think this stat is misleading because if you actually go down the list, the Forrest Sherman is better than the Gearing in almost any way. Let's start with the turret arrangement. Now, the Forrest Sherman's turrets are located here in the front and two more in the back. The Gearings are a little bit different. The Gearing has 2 in the front, 1 in the back. This is going to help the Forrest Sherman if you're kiting away. One thing that I think also helps the Forrest Sherman is the fact that I believe the turrets do full 360. Don't quote me on that. I believe they do. I'm kind of having a hard time remembering at the moment. But it definitely makes it for an interesting gameplay. And you will kind of notice that these are the Dolly Parton style turrets. For any of you guys who don't get that reference, just look up Dolly Parton and look at her most physical attribute. These are the same type of turrets that you would find on the USS Austin or the new Tier 10 Pan-Asian cruiser, I want to call it Genora, but that's because I've been watching Korra lately. The Jinan. Let's talk about range. Let's move on to range. 11.1 kilometers to 12.6 kilometers. Reload 3.0 to 1.5. Now that is definitely technically a strike in the Forrest Sherman's favor, but when you consider that it's 6 guns to 3 guns, 6 to 1, half dozen or the other. 180-degree rotation, 7.2 seconds to 4.5 seconds. That is really nice with the Forrest Sherman because that means that you can get your guns around and get them on target a lot quicker. Maximum dispersion, the gearing 98 meters to the Forrest Sherman 110 meters. Now, realistically, that's pretty much the same when you consider the added range, though technically that could be a strike against the Forrest Sherman. HE damage 1800, that makes sense across the board since they're both technically American 5-inch shells. However, the fire chance is a little bit different. HE fire chance on the gearing 5% to the 9% on the Forrest Sherman. HE pen 21 millimeters. AP damage 2100 versus the SAP damage on the Forrest Sherman. Yes, that is something I forgot to mention. The Forrest Sherman does get SAP, and that makes the ship really dangerous when you're going against it in other destroyers. AP pen 127 millimeters, that's kind of technically true. That's if you're firing at a flat broadside, that's how much you're expected to get through, versus 36 millimeters with the SAP. AP velocity and HE velocity with the gearing is 792 meters per second, where the Forrest Sherman has 808 meters per second. That's definitely going to be a lot better when you're at longer range because the shells will get there a little bit faster and be a little bit less floaty. Very minute, though. You're probably not going to notice in battle. Rounds per minute, both of them are pretty much the same at 120. HE DPM is the same, obviously, since they both have the same rounds per minute. But the AP DPM versus the SAP DPM, you can really see how the Forrest Sherman, it can be a very scary ship when it's 324,000 DPM versus 252,000 DPM. That is scary. Let's move on to torpedoes. Now, these are the base torpedoes on the gearing. We'll get to the upgraded torpedoes here in just a second. 180-degree rotation is the same on both of them. First off, let's talk about the arrangement. I missed that. 2x5, 533 millimeters on the gearing versus 4x1, 533 millimeters on the Forrest Sherman. Reload time base on the gearing is 103 seconds versus 73 seconds of the Forrest Sherman. This is where I'm really disappointed. When I first heard about the Forrest Sherman, I heard about the fixed torpedo angles and I thought, yuck, that's gonna be abysmal to play. And it is. They are very difficult to get torpedoes on target. I have been lucky a few times, but that's mainly been on dirigible battle where you can kind of really easily guess where ships are going to be. But when I then heard that they were going to be rapid reloading, I thought, great. I may not be able to fire out huge volleys of torpedoes, but I can continuously fire torpedoes. I was expecting something like the Mutsu. No. 73-second reload. That's horrendous. Even if they had nerfed these torpedoes, made them something similar to the Holland, where they only do like 9,000, 10,000 damage to ships base, I would have been happy with that. And giving them a 20-second reload, even if they kept the torpedo speed at 66 knots, which is pretty bog standard for U.S. destroyers. I would have thought, great, this is still something I can use. No, 73 seconds, you're launching 4 torpedoes every minute, and you really got to flick your ship around to get those 4 torpedoes out. So realistically, you're only getting 2 torpedoes per minute. That is horrendous. Oh, I hate these. Max damage on the base torpedoes for the gearing, 19,033 versus 17,900 on the Forrest Sherman. 66 knot top speed and torp detect of 1.4 kilometers. Let's go over to the upgraded torpedoes on the gearing. The gearing gets 2x5, 533 millimeters, obviously. 180-degree turn time is still the same, but the reload time goes up to 116 seconds. But I just wanted you to consider this. If the gearing gets one of its torp turrets knocked out, it still has more torpedoes than the Forrest Sherman has if none of its torps get knocked out. That really makes the gearing a little bit more of a threat when it comes to torpedoes. Torpedoes allow any ship to kind of hit above its weight class, and that's definitely something to consider. Now, with these upgraded torpedoes on the gearing, not only does it nerf the reload, but you do get a little bit of a buff to the torpedo range, but you lose a little bit of max damage, coming back down to match the Forrest Sherman with a 16.5 kilometer torp range and a max damage of 17,900. Enough about the torpedoes. Let's move on to depth charges. Now that we know that submarines are going to be coming back into the game, you get to be battling subs. The Forrest Sherman does take the lead here with a 75 rating to the gearing 71 rating. What's the difference? Bombs in a charge, 16 to 14. That's really going to make it a lot better. When you're at speed, you can drop a lot more bombs, you can cover a lot more area and deal maybe a little bit more damage, especially if you know exactly where the ship is going to be. You can kind of slow crawl and really concentrate where those bombs are going to be. AA defense is, they both have the same rating, but I would technically give a tick to the Forrest Sherman because of its damage and its shell explosions. The shell explosions are where you're really going to do damage. Continuous damage, 163 to 152. That's great if you get your flak guns knocked out, but let's talk about the shell explosions. 1680 to 1750. So the Forrest Sherman, when you get shell hit, is going to hit harder. How many shells are in a salvo? 3 in a salvo versus 4 in a salvo, which means that you're going to be firing more shells in your salvo with the Forrest Sherman. So you're going to be doing a lot more damage. Hit probability, 100%. Action zone, 3.5 to 5.8. Same base on the Forrest Sherman with 3.5, but it goes out to 6.0 on the Forrest Sherman. That's really nice, actually, because you can start engaging those aircraft a lot sooner. Firing range of your AA gun, 6.0 kilometers. Priority sector reinforcements the same, as is the instant damage, action time, and prep time. Maneuverability, this is where the gearing is going to really shine because she is a smaller ship. She is a lighter ship. She's not as heavily armored. Maneuverability 66 to maneuverability 59. That's really obvious when you consider that the Forrest Sherman is going to be a heavy destroyer. 36 knot top speed on the gearing to a 33.9, and that's even worse for the Forrest Sherman when you consider that the gearing gets a torpedo boost, and the Forrest Sherman does not. We'll get into that in a little bit. Turning radius, 640 meters to 680 meters. Rudder shift time of 3.3 seconds to 5.3 seconds. That is oof. It makes the ship really difficult when you're trying to kite away from the enemy. It makes it very difficult to dodge shells. Concealment, gearing 87 to Forrest Sherman 83. This is where I was most disappointed, to tell you the truth. Detect by sea, 7.6 to Forrest Sherman 8.3. Now you can get this down to 6.5. However, with the gearing, without the unique module for the gearing, you can get it down to 6.1. With the unique module, I think you can get it down to 5.6 kilometers. So the gearing is a lot more stealthy, and with those more torpedoes, that's going to be a lot better for you. Detect by depths, I assume that means by submarines, 3.4 kilometers, and it's the same with air. Detect by air, 3.4 to 3.8 kilometers. That is really going to hurt the Forrest Sherman when you're trying to avoid aircraft and not get spotted. When you're trying to get into a good camping spot and trying to pop your smoke and start raining HE and SAP down on the enemy. Let's talk about equipment. Damage control module, same across the board. Typical US destroyer, 5-second action time, reloads in 40 seconds, unlimited number of consumables. Smoke generator, the same across. However, you do have more consumables with the gearing at 3 versus 2, but I will say this, in most battles, you're not even going to get a chance to use 3 of them. So after you get... Sorry, my brother is playing a prank on me, which is going to get into the video now. You're never going to really use 3 or 4 of them, and after you get the superintendent, you'll get 3 of them, no problem, and that should be plenty of time to get you through most of a game. Hydro. Forrest Sherman gets a hydro. That is definitely something that is very unique to these ships, or to the Forrest Sherman. A hydro on a destroyer is probably the most OP aspect of any destroyer. I would rather take a destroyer with a hydro versus a destroyer with a radar. I have found that the radar on like the Smollett and the Ragnar, if I could swap it out for even a short distance hydro, like a 3.0, I would prefer that, especially when you're camping in your smoke. It kind of gives you a sixth sense ability to tell when torpedoes are coming at you. Engine boost. Gearing gets an engine boost, and it's typical bog standard engine boost. You get a max speed of 8%, action time of 120, reload of 120. Forrest Sherman doesn't get that. DFAA. The Gearing gets DFAA, but you have to swap it out with your speed boost. So you can either get the engine boost or the DFAA. That's where the Forrest Sherman kind of has a leg up because it's always going to have it. Continuous damage, 100% increase. Shell damage, 300% increase, which is a lot better for the Forrest Sherman when you consider that the shells do a lot more damage. Action time of 40 seconds. Reload time of 80 seconds. Number of consumables, 4. After Superintendent, you can get those up to about 5. Anyway, let's go back into port. Let me show you guys how I've built her. The Forrest Sherman, with the Forrest Sherman, my commander build, this is what I'm running currently. I would like to somehow reallocate skills to get radio location, but I had to give up way too much to get that radio location. So currently, this is the build I'm running with. I'm brainstorming with other individuals on what I can do to get my radio location. And believe it or not, this is the same exact commander build that I use for my gearing. So when it works, don't break it. What am I running for equipment? Main armaments modification, 1. I want to keep my main battery alive, and I want to keep my torps alive. Engine room protection. Aiming systems modification, you want to keep your shells together. The gearing, I could almost argue for the torpedo tube modification if you want to, but she's really not a torp boat. She is really more of a gunboat. And that's actually going back to way back when, before all of these tech tree splits and everything else like that. It used to be if you wanted guns, you went with the Americans. If you wanted torps, you went with the Japanese. Then they split the Japanese line, so the gearing was kind of the jack of all trades. The gearing had both torps and gun advantage compared to each of the Japanese. You could go with the Japanese torpedoes, which would have better torpedoes than the gearing, but would have worse guns than the gearing. Or you could get the Japanese gunboat, which would have better guns than the gearing, but worse torpedoes than the gearing. So she's kind of a jack of all trades. You could run torpedo tubes if you want to, but I would not recommend running them on the Forrest Sherman. Concealment modification. Normally, I would not run this except for the fact that it adds a 5% dispersion by shells fired at enemies attacking your ship. That is really good when you consider that the destroyer is kind of a small ship. A few meters could mean shells completely missing you. That's definitely something you want to run. And then I went with main battery modification 3, and the main reason I did is because I know that there's a tick bug. The best way that I've had the tick bug explained to me is, imagine if, so for those of you guys who don't know, the game World of Warships runs on 7 ticks per second. Flamu has covered this. I would recommend looking up his channel and watching his video on it. He explains it a lot better than I do. I'm going to explain it the way it was explained to me, though. So this game runs on 7 ticks per second to determine if any actions are being taken or required. That's why sometimes if you click your fire button, there's a slight delay before it fires. That's because of the tick rate. Let's make it 8 just to make it easier, and let's imagine the ticks as transit buses. Let's say a transit bus leaves this station every 7.5 minutes. That would mean that there are 8 buses that leave that terminal every hour. If you miss that transit bus, you now have to wait another 7.5 minutes until the next one arrives, or however long you need to wait. You know, like let's say you're half a minute late, you need to wait 7 minutes for the next one to show up. That's kind of what's happening with the tick rate, is when the game says you are reloaded, you're okay to fire, and you go to hit fire, if you've missed that transit bus, you now have to wait for the next transit bus, which with fast reloading guns, especially like this, that's a big, big deal. But World of Warships did say they're planning on fixing it. They're planning on fixing it around patch 11.3, 11.4, so probably mid to late 2022. That is something that we can look forward to getting fixed. But for now, I'm just leaving it this because I'd rather have a little bit better DPM. As these shells are still really floaty, especially for DD shells. Range, really not going to be an option. Torpedo tube modification, why would I really run that? These torpedoes kind of suck. And this doesn't have any auxiliary modifications. The only thing I would get from this is a little bit better AA. Anyway, let's go back and do a quick wrap up on this ship. Would I recommend getting this ship? Would I spend the firepower containers to get this ship? No. If this ship becomes available for doubloons, would I get it? No. This is probably one of the most disappointing tier 10 destroyers I've ever purchased. Is it a fun destroyer? Yes. Is it a unique destroyer? Yes. Am I going to see something similar to it again in the future? Probably, because wargaming loves to repeat themselves. I would wait until this ship becomes available for coal. Once it becomes available for coal, you will be able to purchase it and get it for free. But even if it's available for coal, there's a lot better ships to get for coal. The Marceau is fantastic. I love the Marceau. You could get any number of ships out of the armory other than this ship. And really, I can think of a few things that I would have done to make this ship a little bit different. I actually would have increased the reload time from 1.5 to 2.0 seconds. Now, you may wonder, why? Well, I would have made the guns hurt more when you got a shell hit. Instead of 1,800, I would have given them the 2,100 or 2,000 damage on an HE shell. To kind of offset the lower reload, but it would make you have to hit your shells harder. I've already mentioned the torpedoes. I would make them reload a lot faster, but do a lot less damage. You could even slow them down. I don't really care. If you made them do 60 knots, I'd be happy. With it being a heavier ship, I can kind of understand the maneuverability, but I then would have given it concealment. The fact that its maneuverability and concealment are both horrible. Now, I am comparing this to the Gearing. The Gearing is not a perfect match because the Gearing is a medium destroyer versus the Forrest Sherman is a heavy destroyer. It's kind of like comparing a battleship to a battle cruiser. Yeah, the battle cruiser is going to have better maneuverability, but the battleship is going to have better survivability. That's kind of what this is. The Forrest Sherman has better survivability. The Gearing has better maneuverability. But anyway, I've gone on long enough. I will let you guys make your own decisions. Personally, I would say, for now, skip this ship. Anyway, take care, stay safe, and I'll see you all next time.